he admired most. For Marshall, both Jackson and Lee were inspiring figures, Marshall's best-known biographer tells us. Both great and austere generals, the one an infantry commander of fanatic drive, the other a soldier-statesman whose brilliance in war was capped by his demonstration in peace of how a general could live honorably and constructively in defeat. The ghosts of the defeated Confederacy were brought to life at VMI, and it was said that late on some nights it was possible to see a lamp lit in Jackson's classroom. If you were stealthy enough, you might be able to spy his shadow standing before the blackboard, working out problems. Marshall remembered that there was an old fellow with a scraggly beard who sold nuts in the Institute's sally port. When cadets complained about his disreputable dress, they were told to leave him alone. He was a veteran of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia with a very fine record, and he could sit in that arch till he died. The lives of Lee and Jackson were celebrated at VMI, their example ever present in the young minds of its cadets. It would not be surprising to suppose that some of these young men would imagine how their service might reflect the values of these two, and how some day in battle they might replicate their great heroism. They might even imagine how in some future battle there might come a time when, at twilight, they would meet with a commander to plot the defeat of an enemy, and so be forever remembered in the annals of the nation. But more serious-minded cadets like George Marshall understood that the sweep of history is complex and cannot be relived, and that Everett Giulio's painting, while powerful, is more a representation of an idea than of an actual moment. It is not history. Here is what Shelby Foote says. Lee and Jackson met at sundown on horseback, but Lee did not give the younger man his orders, for he had none to give. Instead, the two withdrew into a nearby clump of trees. Lee did not wear gloves, was not clad in a full uniform, but wore a simple gray coat. Jackson had no cape, but was dressed in a bright, newly tailored uniform that sparked laughter from his soldiers. The two seated themselves on a log, then lay down to rest in a nearby grove. When they awoke, they conferred, studying a map. "General Jackson," Lee asked, "what do you propose to do?" Jackson stared at the map and traced his route. "Go around here," he said. Lee thought for a moment. "What do you propose to make this movement with?" Jackson barely paused. "With my whole corps." George Marshall was not a student of war when he came to VMI, but he was intimately familiar with Lee and Jackson's campaigns by the time he left the Institute and received his Army commission. He understood that while it had only been 4 decades since the meeting of Lee and Jackson at Chancellorsville, war had changed. Conflicts were now fought by soldiers armed with repeating rifles in armies organized by faceless bureaucracies and buried their dead in unmarked trenches. Within 2 decades of Marshall's graduation, iron behemoths were deployed in battle. Poison gas filled the air, and machine guns killed more men in minutes than had been killed at Chancellorsville in a day. The dead of the battles numbered not in the thousands, but in the tens of thousands. Nor would great commanders meet at twilight within rifle shot of their soldiers, but instead would gather with their staffs in large rooms to plan movements over hundreds of miles of terrain. Commanders arrived at battlefield conferences in different uniforms, spoke different languages, and represented different countries. They would not confer, they would argue. George Marshall prepared himself for such a war and was convinced that it was coming. He saw in World War I the outlines of a coming global conflict so bloody and horrible that its breadth would dwarf anything that had happened before. He knew that he would play a central role in this conflict, so he began to write the names of officers he respected in a little black book that he kept with him at all times. When he was finally placed in a position to build the army that would defend his nation, he referred to the names in his book and chose the generals he thought would be his nation's greatest commanders: Omar Bradley, Mark Clark, Joseph Collins, Jacob Devers, Leonard Giraud, Courtney Hodges, George Patton, Walter Bedell Smith, Maxwell Taylor, Lucian Truscott.